long list at Mises University. I think the greatest testament to the success and importance of Mises University is that 13 or 16 of the faculty members that will be teaching you this week attended or graduates of Mises University. In fact, we have 4 generations, 4 academic generations of students, former Mises University on the faculty. The earliest, I won't say the oldest, the earliest graduated or attended in 1989. I won't date anybody mentioning names. The most recent faculty member attended in 2018. So there, as I said, now 4 academic generations of Mises U grads on the current faculty. So what we have are students of students of students of the earliest Mises University students on faculty. And we hope that some of you will go on to pursue an academic career and return as 4th and 5th generation teaching here. That said, I now have the distinct honor of introducing our faculty. And please stand for a moment as you call your name. Mark Thornton, and hold your applause until the end. Jonathan Newman, Tate Fegley, Per Bieland, Lucas Engelhard, Jeff Herbener, Peter Klein, Sandy Klein, Patrick Newman. You can just wave your cronyism book back, you don't have to stand. Right? Wanjiru Njoya, Sean Rittenauer, Timothy Terrell, Carmen Dorbat, Matt McCaffrey, David Gordon, and Bob Murphy. Thank you. And now I have a few announcements. Okay, let me give you the announcements that are important. Breakfast is at the hotel from 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. We'd like you to be in your seats and ready to listen to the lecture by 9 o'clock. So keep in mind that the last shuttle leaves at 8:45. Also bring swimsuits on Tuesday morning since the shuttle will take you directly from the Institute to the Boulevard. And that should be, well, yeah, bring what you want on Tuesday morning, because we'll not be going back to the hotel. Okay, bring swimsuits. Okay. You don't have to wear them. In case anyone real rule follow. And on the way out, there's a bit, folks, we can do these grabs on the way out. I'd love to share research theory. Take your notes up. Give it some involvement. Some other notes. It's going to be very hot outside. We also keep it very. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague and now fearless leader, who will be giving a talk this evening. Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo is the president of the Mises Institute. He holds a PhD in economics from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, now Virginia Tech, and was a university economics professor for 41 years. 4 years. With faculty positions at Loyola University of Maryland, George Mason University, University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Washington University of St. Louis, and State University of New York at Buffalo. Dr. DiLorenzo is the author or co-author of 18 books, including The Real Lincoln, Hamilton's Curse, How Capitalism Saved America, and the problem of socialism and the politically incorrect guide to economics. He's also widely published in the academic literature, including the American Economic Review, Economic Inquiry, Southern Economic Journal, Public Choice, International Review of One Economics, Review of Austrian Economics, Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, and many others. He has appeared on hundreds of radio talk shows, including the Rush Limbaugh Show. After which his book, The Real Lincoln, shot up to number 2 in sales in Amazon.com. So I give you Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, the greatest living opponent, an enemy of Lincoln lovers everywhere, who will speak to us on the axis of evil, America's 3 worst presidents.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for coming. Have a great week. Try to pace yourself a little bit if that's possible. And every year, some students tell us this is the best week of their year as far as school goes. And I'm betting that a lot of you will think that also when you come at the end of the week. And so what I'm going to talk about is America's 3 worst presidents, in my opinion. And before I do that, though, one of the things I hope you'll learn here this week is that Austrian economics and libertarian philosophy provide a very powerful lens through which to study history. As Mises said in Human Action, history has to be interpreted. Facts are just facts. That's why so many history books are excruciatingly boring. And they're all interpreted. Everybody who writes a book on some historical topic interprets the facts in certain ways. And if you understand economics, Austrian School of Free Market, Austrian School of Economics, and are attuned to the philosophy of freedom, you can look at these same facts in a very different way than somebody who is uneducated in those areas. And so with that said, that's sort of what has informed me in my study of these things. Now, as far as the 3 worst presidents go, I'm going to talk about Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and FDR. If you look at the American academic history profession, periodically publishes rankings of the greatest presidents, and Lincoln and FDR are always there at the top. And Woodrow Wilson used to be at the top, near the top, until they discovered about 3 or 4 years ago that he resegregated the U.S. military. And so they took his statue down at Princeton. He was a political science professor at Princeton and also the president of Princeton before he became president. And so I don't know if they burned him in effigy or not at Princeton or whatever, but he's no longer near the top. But he's still one of the worst of all time. Okay. And so why do I think that? Well, I guess I'll start with a chronological order. I'll start with Lincoln. All Americans are taught in elementary school, if not sooner, that Lincoln saved the Union. The truth is, he destroyed the American Union. The American Union was a voluntary union of the founding fathers. A number of states, when they ratified the Constitution, reserved the right to reassume the powers that they had delegated to the federal government. And it was assumed that all the states had that power. That was another way of saying secession was legal. And it was a voluntary union. It wasn't like the Soviet Union, held together with tanks and mass murder. It was a voluntary union. And everyone understood that. New York was one of the states that said this in their ratification document. Rhode Island said the same thing. And so the Union was no longer voluntary after the American Civil War, which I like to call the War to prevent Southern independence. It was literally held together by force, invasion, mass murder. As Murray Rothbard said, the state uses the word war for mass murder, but it's the same thing, isn't it? Now, as far as the cause of the war, one of the things you're probably, if you're an American, you probably never taught this in school, but in July of 1861, the U.S. Congress issued a War Aims Resolution, declaring to the world what the purpose of the war was. And it was called the Crittenden-Johnson Resolution. And here's one part of it. They said, so this war, I'm quoting from it, this war is not waged upon our part in any spirit of oppression. for any purpose of conquest or subjugation. That was a bigger lie. Subjugation? Okay. Here's the key here. Nor purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institutions of those states, by which they meant slavery. So they announced to the world that this war has nothing to do with slavery. This is the U.S. Congress, the House and the Senate, joint resolution, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union. And they meant preserving the Union geographically. They didn't mean preserving the Union philosophically as a voluntary union. They meant the opposite. They meant destroying the voluntary union and forcing bloodshed. Now, in his first inaugural address, Lincoln announced to the world that the war would be fought over tax collection. There's no income tax at that time. Tariffs accounted for about more than 90% of all federal tax revenue. The southern states outlawed protectionist tariffs in their constitution. The northern states wanted a 50 to 60% average tariff rate, and so they understood that all the trade in the world would go to the southern ports, and New York, Boston would be abandoned as far as that goes. There were northern newspapers associated with the Republican Party before the war, many months before the war, calling for the bombardment of Charleston Harbor and New Orleans and the southern ports because they saw this coming. And so in his first inaugural address, Lincoln said at one point, there needs to be no invasion or bloodshed in any state. Now, what could possibly cause the U.S. government to cause invasion and bloodshed among its own citizens in an American state? The next sentence explains what. The average tariff rate had just been doubled 2 days earlier. Okay, and they knew the Southerners had seceded. Some of them, not all of them, had seceded. Virginia was still in the Union, and they had passed this doubling of the average tariff tax. And he said, "It's my duty to collect the duties and imposts, tariffs." And then he said, "But beyond that, there will be no invasion of any state." So he literally threatened war, invasion. He used the word bloodshed and force to describe what's going to happen if you don't collect that tax. And of course, the Southerners didn't intend to keep sending money to Washington D.C. any more than they intended to send money to London or Paris or anywhere. They were no longer a part of the U.S. government. And so, if you want to know the cause of the war, that's the cause of the war, right there. You can also read Jefferson Davis's inaugural address. It was given in Montgomery, Alabama, not too far from here, an hour down the road. He does not say one word about slavery in the address, and he says we are an agricultural nation, we trade with the whole world. There are people in the north who interfere with us and force us to draw from that, and we're willing to defend ourselves if we are invaded. That's what he said in his inaugural address. And so Lincoln started the war over tax collection. He probably thought it would be a short, last maybe a couple of weeks, and that's the biggest political miscalculation in American history. He waged war on civilians for 4 years, killing tens of thousands of them, bombing and burning American cities and towns to the ground, rewarding his plundering, looting, and raping army with promotion of General Sherman. If you read about what happened in the southern states for 4 years, not just Sherman's march through parts of the South for all 40 years, but it's very typical to get to town and burn every single house down. I moved here from the West, beginning of the year from Bluffton, South Carolina, and next to the island. And there's a little book in the bookstore there about what happened during the Civil War in Bluffton. And the Union Army came in and burned every single private home. And they did it all throughout the South, in every business, and then they stole after stealing whatever was stealable. And then just get the people out. When Atlanta, after the Confederate Army had evacuated, there was just women and children and old men there. They spent 4 days shelling Atlanta. They and setting fires. So that's sort of the thing that happened. Okay. Lincoln supported his first inaugural address. He supported a constitutional amendment that would have enshrined slavery explicitly in the Constitution forever. It was called the Corwin Amendment, and it was named after Congressman Thomas Corwin of Ohio. But it was really Lincoln's amendment. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote this 1,000-page book called Team of Rivals, and she cites primary resources showing that this was Lincoln's hand, this was Lincoln's work. He instructed William Seward to get this through the Senate, which he did, and it was passed by the Senate and the House, and it was ratified by 5 states, including Illinois, the land of Lincoln. And it ratified this constitutional amendment that would have prohibited the federal government from ever interfering with slavery. Okay. Now, Lincoln claimed in his inaugural address, he said, "I understand that there's an amendment that would do this with slavery." He said, "I think slavery is already constitutional, but I have no objection to making it, in his words, express and irrevocable." Well, that was another big fat lie. Who could believe that in 1861, an amendment to change the Constitution to pass the House and the Senate to prohibit interfering with slavery in 1861, Illinois ratified it and it's a state that he knew nothing about. He never seen the gas city in charge of another big fat lie. And so that's where he was in 1861, declaring war over tax collection. And if you go online and read the history of the West Bengal, the most powerful defense of slavery never made in American president. American president of the first constitutional amendment to enshrine slavery as a state constitution. He illegally suspended the habeas corpus and also arrested tens of thousands of ruined civilians for taking this as a habeas corpus. He used militarism. Now, the Constitution has a definition of militarism in the U.S. Constitution. He used the word only. And it says only levying war upon the United States or being a couple to their enemies, their enemies. Those days, the United States was always employed around found boundaries of America, meaning the individual states were united in creating confederacy of states. Okay? So levying war against Alabama, Virginia, Louisiana, that's treason in the Constitution. That, of course, is exactly what happened. And he redefined treason to mean criticizing me. And so, literally, tens of thousands of northern people just saying something, criticizing war. In prison without their presence, soldiers would come to your house and tell you, you're in prison. So he is committed treason. He destroyed the system of federalism. He was created by Congress. 90% by eliminating the grants of nullification and secession. Nullification is sort of been come back for the last 20 years in the U.S. The whole idea behind the grant of secession and nullification for the founders was that if politicians in the nation's capital know they pass an unconstitutional law, and states can help them to say we want to enforce it within our boundaries, or they can secede and say, no, it's enough, we don't want to be part of this union. Then politicians in Washington less likely to pass unconstitutional laws. That was thinking behind it. That was split aside. Another thing that was split aside by Lincoln's rule was the idea that all the branches of government had equal say in its Constitution. The President had an equal say in the Supreme Court, as did Congress, as did the people of the states. That was thinking in America before the war. After the war, that would all be determined by 5 government lawyers for lifetime tenure, otherwise known as the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the old Jeffersonians had always warned that if the day came that the federal government became the sole arbiter of the limits of its own powers, that there would eventually be no limits to its powers. They talk about the fox guarding the hen house. shut down over 300 opposition newspapers in the North, and imprisoned some of the owners and editors of the papers, one of whom was the grandson of Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star Spangled Banner, who was imprisoned in Fort McHenry in Baltimore, where his grandfather wrote the Star Spangled Banner. And he wrote an editorial criticizing the illegal suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, and for that he was dragged out of his home in the middle of the night, stuck in a dungeon at Fort McHenry. He rigged the 1864 election, so they had massive censorship of the telegraphs and the mails, and the shutting down of 300 newspapers, and the elections were rigged. Also, these different colored ballots for Democrats and Republicans. Soldiers intimidated the Democrat voters. Democrats who were registered Democrats who were in the army were left out in the field, whereas the Republicans were allowed to be furloughed on election day, that sort of thing. So that happened in 1864. He was a lifelong advocate of what they called colonization. Lincoln was the leader, the chairman of the Illinois Colonization Society, which used tax dollars to deport a small number of free black people who lived in Illinois at the time, which they did. And then when he became president, he still championed that. He had a meeting in the White House of some free black men and urged them to lead by example and go to Liberia, Africa, anywhere but America. And they wisely said no thanks. and so there's a book that was published maybe about 5 or 6 years ago now called Colonization After Emancipation. Philip Magnus, who's now the president of the Independent Institute in California, and a co-author, Sebastian, what's his name? I forget his name, Sebastian something or other. But anyway, Colonization After Emancipation. They showed that they went to the British archives and the U.S. National Archives and got documentation that up until his dying day, Lincoln was working with William Seward and counting how many ships it would take to deport all the black people out of America, the ex-slaves. And that was going on. And for decades, generations, the history profession claimed he had some sort of magical there's no evidence. They just said, well, yeah, this happened. But these two authors proved beyond all doubt, no, it didn't happen. And they believe that until his dying day. He invoked the first military conscription law of the federal government over the execution of deserters. There was some battle, the Battle of Antietam. In the Battle of Antietam, there were 90,000 deserters. Deserters, 180,000 Catholic deserters disappeared in the woods. That's right. So they had they started cracking down on that. And so they had the firing squads. And typically what they would do, they would stand up the deserter over a hole that they had dug, and they would shoot him in the hole and bury him, and they would require all the other soldiers to stand around and watch. And this happened on a daily basis once they were going on to enforce military conscription. He very strongly enforced the Fugitive Slave Act during his administration. This was a federal law that required Northerners to hunt down runaway slaves, and that was enforced in Washington, D.C. during the Lincoln administration. He ignored the fact that all the rest of the world, including all the northern states, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, ended slavery peacefully. England, France, Spain, the Dutch, the Danes, they all found a way to end slavery peacefully. Only the Americans were a war attached to slavery, and even then it wasn't until 2/3 of the war was over, and they had killed maybe 250,000 Southerners, and 1/4 of the adult male population of the South was killed during the Civil War, and more than double that number were maimed for life as farmer slaves, something like that. In 1870, 75% of the budget of the state of Louisiana went for artificial limbs, and other states, it's still in other states. So, as far as the Emancipation Proclamation goes, when I visited the Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, Illinois. I was invited to talk about the Illinois Libertarian Party. And they had a very interesting video, a beautiful cinematic presentation. And they had the face of an ex-slave up there, and a voiceover. And the voiceover were reading the ex-slave's words. The ex-slave, after the war, he knew how to write. And he said, well, we heard about this Emancipation Proclamation, but we knew it wasn't real because we didn't know emancipated. We were free. Which was true. I was shocked that they would actually have that at the Lincoln Presidential Museum, because the Emancipation Proclamation, specifically in the text of it, exempts only applies to rebel territory where they had no ability to free anybody, and it specifically exempts all the areas of the country where the Union Army was in charge. Every parish in Louisiana where the Union Army was in control at the time was exempted by name, right in the text of the Emancipation Proclamation, as was the entire state of West Virginia, which was created by the Lincoln Republican Party during the war. And so they could have freed all the slaves in West Virginia, but they didn't. It's right in the text. It doesn't count in West Virginia. And so the Europeans, of course, all mocked Lincoln for this, and they were a lot of famous Americans too, who just saw this as phony. And Lincoln himself called it a war issue, a war policy. The only logical reason he get court is probably he thought it might incite slave rebellions, which did not. And he also said about it that if the South would rejoin the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation would be defunct immediately. It was the war. Okay, he raised tariffs 10 times, and by the time he left office and was assassinated, the tariff rate was around 60%. He instituted the first income tax in American history, and the tariffs remained at that level for the next 60 years. Lincoln's wife inherited slaves. He married a woman who came from a wealthy Kentucky slave plantation-owning family that was connected to Henry Clay, Lincoln's political idol and mentor. Not literally mentor, but his philosophical mentor. And she inherited slaves, and in those days, the woman could not own that property. They became the property of the husband. Lincoln sold the slaves. So he sold the slaves. He did not free them. He sold them. Around the same time, Robert E. Lee's wife, who was a descendant of Martha Washington, inherited slaves. And her father, in his will, said they were to be freed. Robert E. Lee freed them in 1862. So who taught that in school in America? Robert E. Lee's wife inherited slaves, and he set them all free. Abraham Lincoln's wife inherited slaves, he sold them. Okay, that's exactly what happened. As a lawyer, he represented slave owners, and he would go into court with manacles, putting on a show. This slave is going to go back to my client. But he never represented a runaway slave. Now, the death toll of Lincoln's war, for 100 years, historians said it was 620,000. That's more than all American deaths in all other wars combined. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, all of them. That's just that number. And if you standardize today's population, it would be about 6.2 million. But in the past 5 or 6 years, forensic historical research has informed us that the number is probably between 750 and 850,000. And so if it's at the high number, 850, that would be the equivalent of 8.5 million Americans dying just under 4 years, being killed basically in a war that takes place right here. And the number of people who were maimed physically and psychologically in that war was more than double the number of deaths. So if you translate that into modern day, that'd be a huge number of people maimed physically and psychologically. And so that's why there's a book out by Larry Tagg called America's most unpopular president. It's about Lincoln. During his time, during his lifetime, Larry Tagg, the historian, argues that he was by far the most revile, used the word revile, president in American history in his own time. And after he was assassinated, the Republican Party turned him into a deity. Harper's Magazine once had a lithograph. You can look this up online. It's on the web. There's an angel ascending to heaven with a big angel's wings, and beneath the angel is an open tomb. And the head of the angel is Abraham Lincoln. And that's the sort of thing that went on. They said that the first biography of Lincoln after his death was written said his mother was the most chaste woman since the Virgin Mary herself. And said his father was illiterate, but he read the Bible. And so this kind of stuff. And that went on for decades. Decades. If you're interested in this, there's a book called The Deification of Lincoln in the 1940s that tells the whole story. Okay. As you know, I could probably stand up here for another 4 or 5 days telling you stories like this. But I'm going to go on to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's re-election campaign, when he first became president in 1913, he won the 1912 election. His re-election campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." 3 months after he was inaugurated, he asked for a declaration of war against Germany. Germany wanted peace talks in 1916. The British didn't. And Woodrow Wilson went along with that. The war could have ended right there. 116,000 American men died in that war. So that could have been prevented totally at that point. Of course, the Germans were demonized as, this is long before Hitler, the Germans were demonized as dictatorial monsters. Germany had freedom of press at the time. You could freely criticize the Kaiser, the head of the German government. They had a broader voting franchise than England did, more rights to vote. They had a rule of law, due process of law. The German Kaiser had less power than Woodrow Wilson did in his position. And I'm going to talk about some of the powers that Wilson latched on to. And yet they were demonized as dictatorial and undemocratic. The aftermath of all this was that the French and the British divided up German colonies and Middle East lands to control the oil in the Middle East. How's that turned out so far? Carving up the Middle East arbitrarily and creating all these countries. Here's a statement, a statement by Wilson. It reminds me of something I heard John McCain say. The late John McCain gave a speech to the Veterans Group, and he said something almost exactly like this, just 10 years ago. But when I read this statement I'm going to read to you by Wilson, it reminded me of McCain said almost the exact same thing. Here's Woodrow Wilson saying, "There will come some time, another struggle, meaning a war, in which not a few 100,000 fine men from America will have to die, but many millions to accomplish the final freedom of the peoples of the world." Well, someday, it's almost like he's wishing there will be some war that will involve millions of deaths, and but finally the people of the world will be free. Who the hell does he think he was? Here's Woodrow Wilson, here's Don. Right? That's the way it is. We read this kind of stuff. John McCain the same, as far as that goes. And of course, World War I and the Versailles Treaty led to Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, and all that. Woodrow Wilson paid the provisional government of Russia, around the time of the Russian, just before the revolution, to enter the war, to enter World War I. 400,000 Russians died. 116,000 Americans, but 400,000 Russians died after Wilson paid them to enter the war. The only anti-war political organization in Russia at the time were the Bolsheviks. So the Russian people supported the Bolsheviks, because the people never want war. Whether it's the Russian people or the American people or any other people, it's always the state that wants wars. And so Vladimir Lenin himself once said this, quote, "Our revolution was born of the war." It was the Bolsheviks were the anti-war party. And Lenin himself said that we probably would have gained power had not been for this. In pursuit of corporate welfare, maybe this will be another chapter in one of Patrick Scronia's books. In pursuit of corporate welfare, Wilson ordered the invasion of Mexico 11 times. 11 times. Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, all were invaded by orders of Woodrow Wilson. He was a madman. Every one of you, at some point, if you haven't already, should read an essay called War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. He was a general in the United States Marine Corps, early 20th century. He's said to be the most highly decorated Marine Corps officer in history. And it's online. You can read War is a Racket. And I want to read you one famous paragraph of War is a Racket by Smedley Butler, General Smedley Butler. He said, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. It should be crony capitalism, not capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national Citibank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested, and on and on. And so that's what was going on. And this was about the same period of history. He was a Marine Corps general in the early 20th century, in Woodrow Wilson's day. His new freedom agenda involved creation of the Fed, the income tax, the Clayton Antitrust Act, alcohol prohibition, and the 17th Amendment that created the direct election of senators. Before the direct election of senators started in 1913, U.S. senators were appointed by legislatures. So, for example, if a senator said, from Alabama said, "I'm against the Fed, I don't want us to create the Fed at this time. I go to Washington, I'm going to vote no." And then he goes to Washington and he goes, "Yes," he could have been fired on the spot. They said, "But the way it is now, if you just got elected, you have 5.5 years to collect campaign contributions from the banking industry. So you're never going to leave Washington. You're never going to get You're going to be there forever." In fact, if you were to Google congressional incumbent re-election rates in the U.S., you'll find a chart that says for about the past 50 years, the re-election rate in the House of Representatives is about 95%, and it's maybe 90, 88, 90% in the Senate. So once you're there, it's pretty easy to be there until you collapse, and just croak, you're off back in your office. Wilson, alcohol prohibition eventually came. It was after Wilson, 1920. Wilson was gone, but that was part of his agenda. It lasted 13 years. He censored all telephone and telegraphs and blocked the mail from anti-war papers. If you were in a paper editorializing the war, and the papers were still being widely delivered by mail at that time. He imprisoned thousands for opposing the war, just like Lincoln. He responded to it. There was Ku Klux Klan violence in New Jersey and Ohio and the Midwest. Not Alabama and Louisiana, New Jersey, Ohio, and the Midwest. Ku Klux Klan violence. He had the FBI get involved to spy on who? The black people in New Jersey and in Ohio. And the people who were being targeted by the Ku Klux Klan. That's what Woodrow Wilson did. His Attorney General Thomas Gregory sent thugs into private homes to go through their mail to see if they had received letters or were writing letters to somebody that expressed anti-war sentiments. Can you imagine that coming into your house? Well, I saw the Mar-a-Lago read on TV. I can imagine that. He resegregated the military, like I said. And he claimed that his war was the war to make the world safe for democracy, world democracy. And so, if you're an anti-war protester, what are you in favor of? World dictatorship? So that's it. The Democrat Party of today keeps calling Trump Hitler and a threat to democracy. This is old stuff. This is Woodrow Wilson and his people were saying this